Experiential learning is a concept which I took from the works of John Dewey, Jean Piaget, and Carl Jung, and Kurt Lewin, and William James. And what experiential learning says is that the center of learning is experience, your own subjective experience. William James had this idea which he called radical empiricism. And what he was trying to do with this idea was he was trying to integrate the two major streams in Western philosophy, the empirical stream and the rationalist stream. And what he said was, you know, as human beings, all we have is our experience. And all knowledge begins in our experience, and the way in which we know something is true is that it comes back and proves true in our experience. So experiential learning puts learning in the center of the learning process. As a learner, it's my experience that guides how I learn and says when I have learned something. And the exciting thing about this idea is that when your experience is the center of the learning process, you are in control of it. And you are able then to take initiative and create the kinds of experiences for yourself that you want and that lead to learning for you. The other people who are greatly influential in experiential learning also have made great contributions to our understanding. John Dewey, for example. Most people know him as the founder of progressive education, but what they don't realize is that his whole concept of learning, which he wrote about in a very famous book called Experience in Education, places the learner's experience at the center of the learning process. And he had a radical view of education, which was that it's not the teacher who is the center, but it's the learner who is at the center.
David drew the idea of the learning cycle from the work of Kurt Lewin, John Dewey, and Jean Piaget. And what all these philosophers had in common is that the idea of a cyclical nature of the learning process. And what Dave did, drawing from all three theories, is that the learning cycle is a very dynamic process. And if you can imagine a cycle that is continuing to move around in a very dynamic way, and the individual learners enter the learning cycle in a different way at a different point based on their preferences. For example, a learner who is very feeling-oriented or very concrete, she or he can enter the learning cycle through concrete experience. However, someone who is very thinking-oriented, very abstract student or learner, can enter the cycle through abstraction. And same thing goes with a learner who is a reflective learner, enter through observation. And a learner who is very active, enter the cycle through the active experimentation side. So the idea of the central idea of the learning cycle, no matter where you enter into the cycle continues to move on. So eventually you're going to go through cyclically through all the four modes of learning to complete the whole cycle to become a more effective learner.
When I first started teaching at MIT, after I finished my degree at Harvard in social psychology, I came to the business school there all filled up with all these theories that I'd learned, and began teaching by giving these wonderful lectures on motivation and perception and all these theoretical psychological concepts to these MBA students. And I discovered there was this huge gulf between us, and my theories did not connect with them because what they were interested in were practical things that might relate to their business career. And so really it was out of desperation that I began searching for some other way to teach that would help students learn. And at that time we decided, well, what if we used that learning cycle that Alice was talking about to organize the way we teach? So you can begin a class rather than with a lecture with an experience of some kind that everyone in the class shares, like a case study or some kind of business game, and then have them reflect on their performance in that game, either individually or in small groups, and then have them do readings about the theories that lie behind how to do a particular type of business problem. And then we would have students apply this in their own life. So how does this idea of how you motivate employees, for example, apply in your work situation, and how you might motivate employees? So we organized the class in this way, and really were very excited about how students started to come alive, and this gulf between my boring lectures and the students seemed to disappear. However, the interesting thing was that some of the students had actually enjoyed my lectures, and when we put them in these games kinds of situations, they were uncomfortable. And it was here that I first began to think about this idea that people learn differently. And that some people like lectures, some people don't like lectures. Some people like the little small group action, and so on. I coined the term learning style in the late 60s as a way to describe the differences that people indicated on the learning style inventory that we had created. And in doing so, I was really relying on research that was very popular at that time in the field of what was called cognitive style. And I was trying to differentiate learning style from cognitive style, because learning, in my view, as we've talked about already, is experiential. And it's not just thinking, but it's thinking and feeling, reflecting and acting. When you look at the LSI in relation to other instruments that assess learning, the LSI is unique, I think, among these instruments, and it's the only one that really is based on an explicit theory of learning. Other instruments which measure learning style approach it from limited ways, in that some of them, for example, look at sensory modalities, and they say you're a visual learner, or you're a kinesthetic learner, or an auditory learner. But that really isn't talking about learning, that's talking about how you take in information primarily. The Myers-Briggs type indicator is another widely used instrument that's used to talk about learning style, but actually they describe it not as a learning style instrument, but as a personality type. So here again, they're talking about something quite different than learning. In the case of the Myers-Briggs, there have been many studies, and they all show a consistent pattern, which makes a lot of sense, I think, in that feeling-oriented types on the Myers-Briggs are concrete. Thinking-oriented types on the Myers-Briggs are abstract. Introverted types on the Myers-Briggs are reflective, and extroverted types on the Myers-Briggs are active. So this is a kind of interesting finding, I think, that personality type, your personality, at least as it's measured by the Myers-Briggs, really does have some sort of influence on the way you learn.
I think the impact of the teacher's learning style in the teaching is huge. In fact, the research indicates that teachers tend to teach whatever classes or subjects based on their learning style. So there was one study that indicated that students who were taught on a particular mode of the teacher developed those skills associated with a particular mode, but the rest of the modes that the teacher did not emphasize were fairly underdeveloped. So that, proves to the fact that the teacher has to be aware of the learning cycle, and also it's natural for the teacher to come into the cycle based upon their learning style. However, as a teacher, you have to realize that there are other students in the class who are from totally different learning style than yours. So what we recommend is that when you're designing a course, designing a subject or curriculum, be aware of your learning style and also be aware of your students' learning style, and make sure that you design the course around the students' learning preferences, so that at some point each student is going to hit the modes of the learning cycle. And for example, another study looked at the teacher who designed the course specifically around the whole learning cycle. And what they found at the end of research is that the students showed preferences for each different dimension of the learning cycle, but overall outcome of the learning was equal across learning styles. So that shows the difference of the impact of learning in the classroom or in the students' lives, to the extent that the teacher is aware of what they're doing in the classroom and designing courses around the students' need to learning. The LSI has been widely used in corporate environment as well as in higher education environment. And the primary purpose of using LSI is to understand the student learning style as well as the client learning styles, and develop several training courses or educational courses around the understanding of the learning style of the students and also corporate clients. For example, and to give an example of how it's been used in higher education, the Case Western Reserve University, where David and I teach, started a couple of years ago undergraduate program which was totally designed around experiential learning theory. And the reason for that is there was a tremendous need to improve the student engagement on campus, in classroom, and as an institution as a whole. So this design was based upon three fundamental philosophies: increase student engagement, engage faculty and student interaction through a small class size, one-on-one advising, and thirdly, large activities around experiential learning outside the classroom. So this was the core philosophy that was driving SAGES, which is the new undergraduate program at Case. And David and I actually teach a freshman course within this program, and we use experiential learning as a model in terms of how we teach a class. For example, we start from the learner's experience by helping them understand their individual learning styles, and also we move on to learning skill profiles, where now students understand their skills areas, where what are the skills that I'm lacking or what are the skills that I'm good at, based upon the relationship of the learning styles. And then we move on to team learning, where we apply the concept of experiential learning into the teams. And we divide the group into two groups, and we give them all kinds of group projects for them to understand the theoretical underpinnings of what it is that you have to do in order to be to work as an effective group. And also we use that in our advising process. Since the students have more tools to understand their own learning preferences and learning agenda, it's very useful for us to use on one-on-one advising to help them become better learners.
When you give the LSI to individuals, one of the first things that many individuals say is, could I give this to my wife, or could I give this to my boss, or I wonder what my coworker's learning style is. And many people find that understanding their own learning style and the learning style of the people they work with is a very useful input in terms of understanding the relationship, potential conflicts that come up in the relationship, and really how to work better with that person in problem solving on all kinds of issues. So it was really out of this sort of naturally occurring interest that people have that we began to say the learning style concept and the concept of experiential learning could be applied in teams. And so we developed the whole team learning experience. as a series of exercises designed to help teams understand how to communicate better and how to solve problems and learn better by following a team learning cycle of creating, planning, deciding, and acting, which is actually the experiential learning cycle. We've used the team learning experience with a number of clients to help the teams in their organizations understand their problem-solving and communication process better. One very interesting study that was done quite a number of years ago at Procter & Gamble in their R&D teams discovered that teams that were really effective and creative in product development were teams that followed the learning cycle, this cycle that I was talking about of creating, planning, deciding, and acting in a continually circular process, a spiral really, of activity through those four modes, which led them to the solution to particular product development ideas that they were working on. When it comes to using the team learning experience in the classroom, interestingly enough, when you look at classrooms today in higher education, many professors have students work in project teams. And when you look at the results of these project teams, very often students are very dissatisfied with the teams. They hate being in the team. They are resentful when members of the team don't pull their weight and one person gets stuck with all of the work to do. And so we have used the team learning experience as a way to prepare students to work in a team, to help them, because most students really don't have any idea about team dynamics or group dynamics or how to manage working in a team. This is something new to them. And we found that by a little bit of education up front, so students can understand, oh, there is a way that we can deal with our differences and communicate better, and we can organize our activities around this cycle of learning, they actually feel much better and perform much better about their team, in their team experiences. Not surprisingly, the best way to learn about experiential learning is to experience it. And what we found is that there are a number of exercises that really worked very well to help introduce this concept to folks. One of them is kind of a very simple exercise which uses a floor mat, which basically replicates the learning style grid on which people plot their scores. And instead of looking at the profile on paper, they actually go on the floor mat and stand where their profile is. And what's really neat about this is that if you have a group of people, a class, say, or a training program, or a work team, they immediately get a very physical picture of where they are and where everybody else is in the process. In many organizations, you'll discover that people in marketing are in the accommodating quadrant, and the people in finance are down in the converging quadrant, and people in human resources are in the diverging quadrant. And so this can be an opening line, if you will, for a conversation across functions about how communication can be improved. The stuck truck exercise is an interesting exercise we've used to help small groups experience their process of experiential learning, because in the stuck truck exercise, individuals are asked to solve a problem involving a stuck truck, a truck that's stuck under a bridge, and then they form their individual answers, comparing those with the team answers, and to see whether the team can develop synergy and get a better answer than individuals, and also understand how following this team learning process that we talked about earlier of creating, planning, deciding, and acting helps the team function better. One of the things that you discover when you look at how groups perform based on their learning style in something like the stuck truck exercise is that if a group has one particular style, say they are all assimilating and abstract and so on, they're not going to perform as well as a group that is made up of diverse learning styles. So different members can all contribute different perspectives to the problem. Another thing that people, when they take the learning style inventory, they say, well, you know what? I was thinking about how I learned math when I took the inventory, and if I was thinking about how I cook and learn about cooking, it would be, my learning style would be very different. And what we say is, well, yes, learning is interacting with the environment, so the particular thing you're learning does influence how you learn. And in fact, we think it's a good thing to be able to adapt your style to the particular type of thing you're learning. If you're learning about people, it's great to be a little more feeling oriented. If you want to get to know someone, for example. But if you're learning about mathematics, feelings can get in the way, and it's best to stay logical in the way in which you approach things. So we developed the adaptive style inventory as a way, as a kind of follow-on step to the learning style inventory, to help people look at the amount of flexibility that they show in moving from one type of learning situation to another. So the adaptive style inventory assesses a person's degree of flexibility in learning in 4 different types of situation. A valuing situation, for example, would be one where you're trying to understand another person's point of view. A thinking situation would be understanding the principles on which a theory is based. A deciding situation would be evaluating which of 2 alternatives you are going to choose. And an action situation would be completing a task on time. So a person may have a general learning style which is abstract, and so they would naturally be good at and maybe not change their style in understanding principles and theory. But the question is, when they have to complete a task on time, are they able to flex their style and take a more active, initiative-taking, risk-taking kind of role? When you think about a person's learning style, we don't advocate or believe that that's the only thing that determines how a person learns. We had talked earlier about how personality can have an impact on learning style. But also, probably the most obvious thing that influences learning ability to learn other than learning style is skills that you develop in your life. So while a person may not be naturally abstract, they may be a very concrete person, if they have developed a lot of skill in using computers and in technology, that will automatically draw them down into the ability and the skill of doing analytical kind of work. So we developed the learning skills profile, which is developed in terms of a clock. And basically the clock follows the learning cycle such that at 12 o'clock you have relationship skills, and at 1 o'clock you have help skills, and at 2 o'clock you have sense-making skills, and then you move down to 5 o'clock, which is theory skills, and 6 o'clock, which is analytic or quantitative skills, and then you go to 9 o'clock, which is action skills. So around these 12 clock positions are 12 skill areas that correspond with the learning style modes and the learning cycle. And so we've developed this as a way for a person to assess their current level of skill in these areas. And this gives them a profile of their skills, which they can then match to the second part of the learning skills profile, which is what are the demands of your job or the demands of your particular course that you're taking in terms of those skills. So they are able to assess their job, for example, which may require a lot of interpersonal skills, and compare that with their own profile of what their skill level is interpersonally. And this gap then becomes a way for them to plan for development. So for example, if their skills exceed their demands, this, interestingly enough, may be a case where the person is bored in their job. And so if they have a lot of those negative skill gaps, it may be an indicator that you ought to think about getting a bigger job, or a job that is more challenging for you. Whereas the reverse, where the skills are less than the demands, would indicate, well, this may be a place where you could improve your performance by developing this skill further.